I apologize for filming this from my living room, but this just happened, so I wanted to get a video out. So Donald Trump, the President of the United States, just called Jerome Powell, the Chairman of the Federal Reserve, a major loser and Mr. Too Slow, publicly on his own Truth Social network. I'll put the screen grab up so you can read it. But basically, Donald Trump then proceeded to demand that the Federal Reserve and Jerome Powell lower interest rates immediately. Now, this is not a political channel, so we're going to focus on the economic and financial implications of this. But the irony of all this is that the Federal Reserve was already on a path to lowering interest rates. One of the main reasons the Federal Reserve is now hesitant to lower interest rates is because of Donald Trump's own policies, primarily those revolving around tariffs. So we will cover that. We will also use this as a perfect time to clear up some misconceptions about the Federal Reserve that I think the general public still have. So with that said, as always, my name is Derek. I got my degree in finance, so you don't have to. Let's dive right in. Now, before we talk about the irony of this feud between Donald Trump and Jerome Powell, let's clarify some misconceptions about the Federal Reserve. The first one being that the Federal Reserve is a private institution. It's not. The Federal Reserve is an independent governmental organization. It was created by an act of Congress, and it reports to Congress. The reason why there's this misconception that the Federal Reserve is private is primarily because member banks receive a dividend from the Federal Reserve for holding reserves with them. With that said, guess where any profit above the small dividend sent to member banks goes to? It goes to the U.S. Treasury. Not only that, but the chairman is appointed by the president. In fact, to add to the irony, Jerome Powell was appointed by Donald Trump. Now, the reason why the Federal Reserve is an independent governmental organization is to keep the money supply non-political. Now, this is very important because if it were instead controlled by the president directly, then either party, because both Democrats or Republicans would do this, they would basically politicize the money supply. They would raise or lower interest rates whenever it was beneficial to their politics. The entire purpose of the Federal Reserve is instead to control monetary policy and really only change monetary policy to accomplish two main things. This is known as their dual mandate. The first one of those things is maximum employment. The next one of those things is price stability, basically keeping prices stable and increasing at roughly 2% per year because that is the target inflation rate. Now, another thing that we have to understand all of this is something known as R star. This is the neutral rate of interest, and it kind of explains why the Federal Reserve sometimes does things that doesn't really make sense. Like just a few months ago, they started cutting interest rates, and people naturally wondered why. The job market was strong, and inflation hadn't reached the 2% target rate yet, so why would the Federal Reserve cut the FFR, which is the federal funds rate? Well, it has to do with the neutral rate of interest. Basically, there is this rate of interest which is unknown at any time, so you basically have to try to find it, and that rate of interest, R star, maximizes employment while keeping prices stable at that level of inflation. So when the Federal Reserve starts to lower the FFR, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're lowering it below R star, or the neutral rate of interest, which means that the Federal Reserve can lower interest rates while still having a positive effect on inflation, but also while allowing the job market some room to breathe because at the time, the unemployment rate was increasing. And that also relates to today. The Federal Reserve a few months ago had begun lowering the FFR, its interest rate, but has now paused doing so because the inflation data isn't coming in as good as they like. And this is, of course, where we begin to talk about the irony of this feud between Donald Trump and Jerome Powell. Another major reason why the Federal Reserve has not restarted its path to lower interest rates is precisely because of Donald Trump's own policies, and those primarily revolve around tariffs. Now, if you think that the end goal for tariffs is good, that's fine. That's not the topic for today's video. The point is, tariffs, regardless of whether the end goal is good or not, are inflationary by nature. They cause cost of goods sold to increase for domestic companies, and they also make it more expensive for foreign entities to send cheaper goods into the United States, which are both inflationary. So the irony of all this is that Donald Trump is getting upset at Jerome Powell and the Federal Reserve for not lowering interest rates fast enough, even though they were already on a path to lower interest rates. But at the same time, he is implementing policies that make it very difficult for the Federal Reserve to be able to do so because they don't know how much of an inflationary effect these tariffs are going to have on the economy. And that is only one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is that Donald Trump has flip-flopped multiple times on these tariffs. Now, is that a negotiation tactic? Is that because the bond market crashed? I'm not so sure. But for the Federal Reserve, it is a sign of uncertainty. So for them to be able to proceed to lower interest rates, they need to see that the inflation rate is coming down to 2%, but they also need to be relatively certain that Trump is not going to drop a massive inflationary policy onto the market at a moment's notice like he's done multiple times during the last couple of months. First, it was tariffs on Canada and Mexico, and then those were paused. And then they were started again, and then they were paused. Then it was reciprocal tariffs, which weren't really reciprocal, and I made a video on that, and then those were paused. But the over 100% tariff on China is still in effect, and those reciprocal tariffs were only paused for 90 days. So in 90 days from now, is Trump going to reinstate those tariffs, which would then add more inflationary pressure to the economy? So the irony of this entire situation is that Donald Trump keeps blasting Jerome Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve, for not lowering interest rates, while at the same time, his primary economic policy, above all else, is tariffs, which are inflationary by nature. And on top of all that, the Federal Reserve was already on a path to lowering interest rates, and if the economy had just kept chugging along without the threat of tariffs, there's a decent chance that they may have already lowered interest rates again at this point. They are now hesitant to do so because of the likely inflationary effects that tariffs would have if implemented at any level, and they're already being implemented. So, of course, Jerome Powell and the Federal Reserve are going to wait for the next inflation report, and probably the inflation report after that, to at least see what the effect of the current tariffs are on inflation before returning to a path to a monetarily easier policy of lower interest rates. Now, of course, Trump has also criticized Jerome Powell for being late to the game when it comes to raising interest rates during the 2020 and 2021 financial crisis, and honestly, that is true. But with that said, the Federal Reserve has historically been late to raising or lowering interest rates, and that's because they really are data-driven to some degree. They wait for the inflation reports and they wait for the unemployment reports to then make policy changes. And of course, that's going to have a lag when it comes to implementing their interest rate cuts. And you can actually see this on a graph. There is a lag between inflation increasing and the Fed raising interest rates, and inflation decreasing and the Fed lowering interest rates. So while that criticism may have some merit, the fact of the matter is the Federal Reserve is hesitant to lower interest rates quicker precisely because of Donald Trump's tariff policies. Now, the Federal Reserve's next meeting is on May 7th, so we'll have to see if they will lower their FFR at that meeting. But when you look at the CME Watch tool, which basically tracks the likelihood of Fed interest rate cuts, it's looking like they most likely won't. And in my opinion, that's probably going to be the case. The primary reason being that they're going to want to see probably at least one more inflation report to see how the current tariffs, which are already in place, are affecting prices. But we'll have to wait and see. I hope you found this video informative. If you did, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And if you like personal finance, world economics, and investing, you're in the right place. Usually these videos are filmed from my office and they're much more edited, but this just happened and I just had to point out the irony of that. So again, if you like personal finance, world economics, and investing, you're on the right place. So I hope you stick around till the next video. Until then, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.